been telling my wife this for years, size doesn't matter.
It's one of the most unique conferences in college sports, given its makeup of schools in the middle of the country, and that, like the old Big East, it's split in membership largely between football-only and all-sports members. But that's not the major talking point for this conference. Like the Southern Conference, the Missouri Valley is the genesis for a significant chunk of FBS teams today, with 15 of its former schools now playing at the highest level of football, soon to be 16 with the Conference USA's impending addition of Missouri State, and 11 of those 16 schools are considered power conference schools today. Not that bad for a conference that, officially, hasn't sponsored football since 1985, though a football-only conference with its namesake shares much of its history. And that modern FCS iteration has produced some of the most dominant football programs of its era, including 12 of the last 14 FCS national champions. While the conference has been a feeder league for schools leaving to other conferences for years, it seems to have stabilized itself. And it's done so by taking smaller schools with the capability to become good programs and retaining a consistent focus along the central United States, even if that sphere of influence has shifted to the north and to the east in recent years. Come along with me as I look through the history of one of the most interesting mid-major conferences in college sports, the Missouri Valley Conference. For the sake of completeness, I will be discussing both the Missouri Valley and the Missouri Valley Football Conferences in this video. Much of the Missouri Valley Football Conference is made up of members of the other conference, but there are members of each conference that choose to play elsewhere. For example, North Dakota State is an MVFC conference member for football, but a Summit League member for other sports, and even sends their wrestling teams to the Big 12 Conference. On top of all of that, the histories of both the Missouri Valley and MVFC overlap in certain spaces, so bear with me, because it might get convoluted in certain spots. But the story of the Missouri Valley begins over 100 years ago, with the MVIAA, the Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletics Conference. Formed in 1907, it's easy to see how the league got its name, being made up of schools that were, for the most part, located within the Missouri River Valley: Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Washington University of St. Louis. Only one Division I conference is older, that being the Big Ten. Before its first season of play ended, it also brought in 3 more schools in Iowa and what would become Iowa, Iowa State, and Drake. Iowa wouldn't stay in the conference for very long. Uniquely, it had split its membership between both the Missouri Valley and the Big Ten, and in 1911, it decided that the Big Ten would be where it would move all of its athletic teams. The Missouri Valley backfilled with Kansas State in 1913, and over time grew larger with its additions of Grinnell College in Iowa in 1918, and then stretched into the south with the addition of Oklahoma from the Southwest Conference in 1919. Their rivals in Oklahoma A&M joined in 1925. The early era of the Missouri Valley wasn't without its fair share of important historical events. I've talked at length before about the Jack Trice incident in 1923, where a game between Minnesota and Iowa State players ended with Jack Trice, a black player, being killed on the field by Minnesota players. Such an event eventually resulted in Iowa State being host to the only stadium in the Power 5, so far, that is named after a black athlete. But nearly as soon as it started, the Missouri Valley faced a conference-defining shift, as the largest universities, Iowa State, Nebraska, Missouri, Kansas, Kansas State, and Oklahoma, took their ball and went home in 1928, splitting from the normal conference and creating another Missouri Valley Intercollegiate Athletics Association, one nicknamed the Big Six. The Big Six would later grow into the Big Seven and then the Big Eight, and would merge with the Southwest Conference to become the Big 12 in 1996. The former Missouri Valley, now just left with Oklahoma A&M, Drake, Grinnell, and Washington, did not uphold its power conference status. Think the Pac-12 after all its major powers left in other conferences. In order to keep the conference afloat, the Missouri Valley added Creighton that year, keeping a presence in Nebraska. During its first 21 seasons, the Missouri Valley's football conference was only won by one team that didn't leave for the Big Six, Oklahoma A&M in 1926. But running out of similarly sized schools to keep the conference afloat in all sports, the Missouri Valley was forced to look outside of the region for the first time, adding Butler in Indiana in 1932. The distance proved to be too much for the Bulldogs, and they left the conference after just 2 seasons. They were replaced by the Tulsa Golden Hurricane in 1934. Over the years, Tulsa would become the primary football power of the conference, finishing with 25 conference championships in football. The next team on that list that isn't currently a Power 5 program is Drake, with 6. They dominated the league. Wanting to re-establish a base in Kansas, the Missouri Valley briefly employed the talents of the Washburn Ichabods starting in 1935. The Billikens of St. Louis would become the second team in the city to join in 1937. Grinnell College would leave in 1939. The Pioneers, alongside Wash U, were the two smallest schools in the conference, and travel to and from the rest of the schools was starting to become taxing. Another smaller school, Washburn, had removed their football team from play in 1940 and would only remain affiliates for other sports until 1943. They weren't the only departures either, as Creighton and WashU would remove their football programs from competition in 1942. Grinnell and Washington would later drop down to Division III, while Washburn would drop to the NAIA and later Division II, and Creighton would drop their football program altogether. To replace the Pioneers, Ichabods, Bears, and Blue Jays, the Missouri Valley would add another school that would become a fixture of the conference, the Wichita Wheat Shockers, later known as Wichita State, in 1945. Wichita State had become a bit of a trailblazer in a lot of different ways, with the first night college football game in history being played against future Missouri Valley member Washburn in 1905, and it would continue to be a trailblazer in other ways into the future. But now left with just a few programs, the Missouri Valley went back to expansion. Once again out of local options, the conference stretched east again, grabbing Bradley University in Illinois in 1948 once Washington left the conference officially. They would go as far east as they ever had in 1949 with the addition of Detroit Mercy to replace St. Louis, who was ending their football program. They let their familiar conference footprint again in 1951 to add the Houston Cougars, creating a conference that stretched from the Rust Belt down through the Great Plains and all the way to the Gulf South. It was one of the largest conferences in terms of geographical area in the entirety of the NCAA, and it was about to be rocked by some of the biggest scandals in college sports history. The year is 1951. The 17 Missouri Valley Conference's football season features two juggernauts in Tulsa and Drake. The Bulldogs had gone 6-2-1 the year before and were prepared to make the jump to winning the conference title, something they hadn't done outright since 1931. A pivotal part of that offense was halfback Johnny Bright. Bright, from Fort Wayne, Indiana, had led the entire country in total offense in 1949 and 1950 after deciding not to sign with Michigan State in 1947. A Wildcat quarterback listed at halfback, he ran for 1,232 yards and threw for 1,168 yards in 1950, which had completely reset the NCAA records for yards of total offense. He was a national favorite for the Heisman Trophy before the 1951 season began at Drake. The Bulldogs were getting serious national title contention, all with Bright at the helm. He started the year off unstoppable with the Bulldogs, helping lead them to a 5-0 record to start the year after putting up stupid numbers against schools like Bradley, Northern Iowa, and Detroit, leading up to a game against Oklahoma A&M. Only there was one problem. Johnny Bright was black. You see, in 1951, the United States was still heavily segregated along color lines, especially in the American South. I've mentioned in a few videos before that some conferences that straddled states with and without Jim Crow laws often played under gentlemen's agreements, where if the game was played in a southern state like Oklahoma or Missouri, a northern team would just not play any of their black players, if they had them. But Drake refused to sit their Heisman candidate when they arrived in Stillwater on October 20th, 1951. It was the first time a highly publicized black athlete had elected to play in a game on southern soil, and Oklahoma A&M defensive tackle Wilbank Smith was enraged about it. Smith targeted Bright on every play, tackling outside the whistle and using dirty tactics to knock Bright unconscious at least 3 times in the first 7 minutes of the game. On one final pass play, Smith reached underneath Bright's helmet and broke his jaw long after the ball had left Bright's hands, leaving him unable to finish the rest of the game. Since the game was in Stillwater, Drake couldn't do much to protest in the moment. They lost, 14-27, and upon returning home to Iowa, announced that they would leave the Missouri Valley if no disciplinary action was taken against Oklahoma A&M. Despite multiple literal assaults happening against one targeted player on the field during a game, the Missouri Valley failed to act, and Drake left the conference for the 1952 season. In solidarity, Bradley left as well. Aside from being a watershed moment for the Missouri Valley, it would later prove to be a watershed moment for the NCAA as a whole, as the incident caused the governing body to enact new rules about legal blocking and face guards to protect players. Bright would go on to become one of the best running backs in the CFL, but it would take Oklahoma State until 2005 to apologize for the incident. The good news, though? Both Wilbanks and Bright are on record as saying they're glad the incident happened because of the change it brought to civil rights in college sports. 1951 wasn't done yet with scandal, as Bradley would also be indicted on a point-shaving scandal with the CCNY Beavers. Players like Gene Melchior, Aaron Priest, and Bill Mann were some of the Braves indicted in the scandal. Drake and Bradley would both later rejoin the Missouri Valley, Bradley in 1955 and Drake in 1956, but neither school brought their football programs back. Drake would eventually bring back their program in 1971, but Bradley refused to, right up until their final year of sponsoring football in 1970. But with 2 programs gone, the Missouri Valley was back to needing to expand again. They returned east to add Cincinnati in 1957, alongside North Texas State, right as Detroit removed their teams from Missouri Valley competition due to increasing travel costs. A year later, in 1958, Oklahoma A&M would finally leave the Missouri Valley, joining their rivals in the Big Six Conference and leaving the Missouri Valley again with just 5 members for all sports, though Bradley and Drake returned as associate members. It's at this point where the second iteration of the Missouri Valley begins to take shape, one that's more reminiscent of a turnstile, with Houston's departure to pursue independence in 1960 and the addition of Louisville in 1963. Memphis State would join in 1968, 2 years before Cincinnati would leave in 1970, followed by the admission of New Mexico State the same year. 1970 was accompanied by tragedy, with Wichita State's football team experiencing a plane crash that took the lives of 30 players and staff. Drake's football teams would return to Missouri Valley competition in 1971, and West Texas State, now known as West Texas A&M, joined in 1972. Memphis would leave in 1973. 1975 saw even more turnover as North Texas State and Louisville both left, with the Cardinals joining former members Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Memphis State in the Metro Conference. Louisville's stated reasoning for leaving was simple, and it was the same as Cincinnati's and Memphis State's. Instead of focusing on Eastern membership to satisfy those basketball powers, they tried to go west and grab teams to strengthen football. Those Southwestern teams proved to be too much strain on the others' travel costs, causing them to leave and provide a significant hit to the Missouri Valley's reputation. To replace them, the Missouri Valley once again returned to the Midwest with the additions of Southern Illinois in 1975, Indiana State and the return of Creighton without football in 1976, and Illinois State in 1980. But this created one of the most interesting conferences in terms of composition in recent memory. Up until 1978, the NCAA had operated under just 2 divisions, the college and university divisions. The college divisions were made up of smaller schools, while the larger schools were placed in the university division. The Missouri Valley had been a university division conference, but in 1978 the divisions were realigned into another format. The university division was now Division I, and it would be split into 2 separate halves. Division 1A, where more of the larger schools would play, and Division I AA, where some of the smaller schools would. Labeling schools as Division 1A and Division I AA was done under a set of rules. To be 1A, a school had to fill their schedule with at least 60% other 1A schools, have a stadium that seated 30,000, or averaged at least 17,000 fans in attendance per game, or drawing an average of 17,000 in the last 4 seasons. They also had to maintain at least 8 sports overall. This sometimes split some of the smaller 1A conferences along lines, and no conference was more an example of this than the Missouri Valley. In 1980, only 3 of the Missouri Valley schools were considered 1A: Tulsa, New Mexico State, and Wichita State. The other schools were all considered 1AA. This would prove to be another massive moment in the history of the conference. The confusing split between what would later become FBS and FCS created an income inequality amongst its members. Indiana State left in 1981 to be an independent, and New Mexico State would leave the conference in 1983 to join the Big West, and now with just 2 Division 1A members, the conference was falling apart. The best course of action, they decided, was to cut football from its list of sponsored sports. 1985 would be the final season of Missouri Valley Conference football, and after the season, West Texas would choose to leave as well. Tulsa and Wichita State would become FBS independents for the 1986 season, with the Shockers dropping football after the year due to rising costs. Drake would send its football teams to play in the non-scholarship Pioneer League. But those remaining 1AA schools still needed a conference for their football teams to play in, and to do so, they found an unlikely partner. The Gateway Conference had been a women's-only basketball conference started in 1982 by Missouri Valley members, since there was no women's league for the Missouri Valley at the time. Now that there was no football league in the Missouri Valley, the Gateway Conference brand was perfect to add a football-only league. It started with a merger between the leftover Missouri Valley football members and the football-playing members of another 1AA conference, the Association of Mid-Continent Universities, later known as the Summit League, to create a football-only league with charter members Eastern Illinois, Illinois State, Northern Iowa, Southern Illinois, Southwest Missouri State, and Western Illinois. Indiana State would join the league a year later.
Hey Valley fans, do you want to dance? It all starts at Arch Madness.
Arch Madness. If you want to keep playing, you've got to keep winning. Don't miss the 2013 Missouri Valley Conference Men's Basketball Tournament, March 7th through 10th at Scott Trade Center. For more information on Arch Madness, visit archmadness.com.
Let's dance.
With the football branch officially gone and the Gateway forming as a spinoff, the 8-member Missouri Valley turned its focus to basketball. Basketball had been the strong suit of the conference anyway, and its young basketball tournament was proving to be a boon. Beginning in 1977, the Missouri Valley's conference tournament originally was held in alternating host locations, such as Henry Levitt Arena in Wichita or the Holman Center in Terre Haute. But starting in 1991, the conference tournament began being played in St. Louis, first at the Kiel Auditorium in 1991, and then in a handful of different host venues in St. Louis proper. Since then, it's been given the name Arch Madness, which is a play on the popular term for the National Basketball Tournament held in March, March Madness. It's widely considered to be one of the most entertaining conference tournaments in college basketball, with its winner earning an automatic bid to the national tournament. Even long before that, the conference had laid claim to multiple national championships. Oklahoma A&M, led by Henry Iba, won 2 national championships in 1945 and 1946. Cincinnati also won 2 national championships in 1961 and 1962, and almost won one in 1963 while members of the conference. Bradley, Louisville, Drake, Memphis State, Wichita State, and Indiana State all also made Final Fours, mostly on the back of some all-time great players like Larry Bird. They'd look to pull in members of the Gateway, with Southwest Missouri State, renamed to just Missouri State in 2005, joining in 1990, Northern Illinois in 1991, and Pioneer League member Evansville in 1994, becoming the last few additions to the Missouri Valley proper for a long time. Tulsa would become the first school to largely depart from the Missouri Valley in 1996. They joined the Western Athletic Conference in all sports, bringing over a really underrated football program that had historically been really good. By this point, both the football and basketball conferences were starting to take shape. In 1992, the Gateway had officially merged back with the Missouri Valley as an affiliate league, but retained its name, changing it to the Gateway Football Conference. Eastern Illinois' departure to the Ohio Valley Conference in 1996 necessitated another addition, this time in the Youngstown State Penguins in Ohio, who were coming off a few national championships in 1991, 1993, and 1994, with Western Kentucky joining later in 2001. In terms of basketball, it started to be known as a power conference without being a power conference, thanks to some incredible play by some of its teams. In 2006 specifically, the conference tournament featured over 17,000 spectators for a game between Southern Illinois and Northern Iowa, and plenty of fans watching the other quarterfinal between Bradley and Wichita State. These teams were so talented that all 4 made the NCAA tournament at the end of the season, something nearly unheard of from, quote, mid-major programs. Weirder still is that it should have been 5, with the 2006 Missouri State Bears being good enough to make the field, but not for some reason. Later teams like the 2013 Wichita State Shockers, led by Fred Van Vliet and Ron Baker, would make the Final Four and would finish the regular season the next year at 35-1. But the football conference wasn't out of the woods. Western Kentucky moved up from the FCS to the FBS in 2006, leaving the Gateway with just 7 members.
They found new members in D2 programs North Dakota State and South Dakota State, who had been playing in the Great West Conference. These 2 are obviously my favorites, as being a guy from North Dakota, I basically got to grow up with the programs. Now the Bison and Jackrabbits were joining the Summit League and other sports, but needed a landing spot for their football programs. The Gateway was the perfect spot. The Bison specifically had been D2 powerhouses for a while. As members of the D2 North Central Conference from 1922 to 2003, the Bison had been to the playoffs 18 times, winning 5 of 6 D2 bowl games before the division adopted a playoff. Of those 18 trips to the playoffs, the Bison won the national championship 5 times. They hired Craig Bowl in 2003 and joined the Great West in 2004, but hadn't made the postseason since 2000 and were ineligible from 2004 to 2008, their first season in the Gateway. The Jackrabbits had been to the D2 playoffs just once in 1979, but were natural rivals with the Bison and made perfect sense to add. Upon their addition to the Gateway in 2008, the conference officially renamed itself the Missouri Valley Football Conference. The Bison immediately took over the league, winning their first league championship in 2011 and not doing anything else but winning championships even up to this current year of 2025. Following their rivals, South Dakota State slowly improved as a program until they finally won the conference in 2020 and won back-to-back national championships in 2022 and 2023. Both of these programs have become key pieces to putting the conference on the map.
The modern era is where more change arrives for the Missouri Valley. South Dakota would join the football conference in 2012, and 2013 saw the addition of Loyola Chicago into the conference for all sports other than football. This was due to Creighton's departure for the Big East Conference, making them, ironically enough, the westernmost member of that league. It wasn't long before Wichita State in 2017 decided that they had also outgrown the Missouri Valley, and left the conference to be the non-football member of the American Athletic Conference. This came after a long stretch of very talented teams in both baseball and basketball, leading to them sort of bullying the Missouri Valley a bit. The Shockers had not only won a national championship in baseball, but had reached 6 consecutive NCAA tournament bids, including a Final Four run in 2013. Losing Creighton and Wichita State pretty much back-to-back severely hurt the image of the basketball program, leading to some concerns about Bradley going elsewhere as well. So it came as no surprise that when the Shockers left, the remaining members of the Missouri Valley fan bases shut the door behind them. To replace the Shockers, the Missouri Valley turned to Valparaiso the same year. The football side of the conference wasn't done expanding. They completed the Dakota Quadrumvirate by finally bringing in North Dakota from D2 in 2020. The addition of the Fighting Hawks finally brought in every D1 member of the Dakotas to the football conference. The other sports league brought in Murray State in Kentucky, Belmont in Tennessee, and Illinois Chicago in 2022 to replace the departing Ramblers, who were leaving for the Atlantic 10. Murray State would move their football programs to the MVFC later that following year. And even still, the Missouri Valley continues to be a turnstile, losing its only team remaining in the state of Missouri, Missouri State, to Conference USA this year. It's unknown where exactly the Missouri Valley as a whole would go from here, but previous conversations have been held with teams like Missouri Kansas City and Texas Arlington. That will depend on whether or not the Missouri Valley is seen as a stronger brand than conferences like the Summit League or the WAC. And with their prior performances, it's no wonder that they might be, even just starting at their separation from the Big Six in 1928. Since 1928, the main sport of the Missouri Valley has been basketball, and it's hard to see that changing. Almost every member of the conference, historical or otherwise, has had very good teams play under the Missouri Valley banner. Aside from the 4 NCAA national championships I mentioned earlier, the Missouri Valley has a long history with the NIT, once seen as an alternative to the NCAA tournament. The conference has claims for NIT championships in 1957, 1960, 1964, 1981, 1982, and 2011, with a handful of second-place finishes and tournament titles by former or future Missouri Valley members as well. On the women's side, Creighton won the WNIT in 2004, followed by Missouri State in 2005. It's impossible to talk about Missouri Valley basketball without mentioning some of its most important players in history. Players like Indiana State's Larry Bird, Oklahoma A&M's Bob Kurland, Illinois State's Doug Collins, Creighton's Kyle Korver, and Bradley's Chet Walker helped ensure that the Missouri Valley was considered one of the best basketball conferences in the country year in and year out. An underrated sport helmed by the Missouri Valley is baseball. Old friend Creighton hosts the College Baseball World Series in Omaha, and in a lot of ways, baseball continues to be the understated meat to basketball's bones. The only Missouri Valley team to win a national championship was Wichita State in 1989, but plenty of other teams and players were very competitive, including the Creighton Blue Jays, who once employed the talents of the legendary Bob Gibson on their team. Secret Base's favorite tortured soul, Dave Steve, even played baseball for Southern Illinois in 1978. That's not to ignore some of the other sports the conference currently sponsors. Cross country, track, soccer, and golf have each had talented programs. Drake won the men's cross country title 3 straight years in 1944, 1945, and 1946. Oklahoma State won one in 1954, followed by Houston in 1960. St. Louis won men's soccer national championships in 1959, 1960, 1962, 1963, 1965, 1967, 1969, 1970, 1972, and 1973. Men's golf saw national championships from Houston from 1956 to 1960. For the women, Tulsa won national championships in 1982 and 1988. For the football conference, domination has been the name of the game in terms of national championships, essentially for the last 15 years or so. Youngstown State won the conference's first national championship in 1997, followed by Western Kentucky in 2002, and then North Dakota State from 2011 to 2015, an off year, then again from 2017 to 2019, another off year, and then again in 2021. South Dakota State would win their first national championships in 2022 and 2023, and then the Bison would take another in 2024. If you're counting, that means since 1992, when the Gateway officially reconnected itself with the Missouri Valley, the conference has won 14 of 32 national championships and 12 of the last 14. 10 of those 12 all belong to Fargo. But if dominance is what you're after, just take a look at Oklahoma State's wrestling program. My goodness. But anyway, the Missouri Valley remains one of the country's greatest mid-major conferences, and it looks to remain that way going into the future. As always, stay safe out there, guys. Be nice to each other in the comments. I'll see you next time.